Hi there, knife people. Hello, lady and gentlemen. As I was working on the review of this knife, Kershaw Launch 20, I realized that while it remains similar in its construction to other launch knives, its disassembly reassembly procedure is quite different, or different enough to grant this video, because believe it or not, and I found it hard to believe, they made disassembly and reassembly of this knife even easier than those on the previous launch models. There's no need to remove the pocket clip to disassemble the knife. I actually found it useful, unlike many other knives, to keep it on. I'll explain why when we get to the reassembly stage. I loosen these screws. They will not likely fall out because they're somewhat retained by the pocket clip. Once the screws are loose, I'm switching to a T8 and loosening the pivot screw. Move them to the side. Now I'm ready to remove the scale. I sometimes use a plastic pry bar or a sharpened chopstick, which I will stick to this time, to sort of shift the scales. I'm putting my hand down to keep all the springs. There are two springs in there, a clock spring in the pivot and a barrel-shaped spring under the plunger. And I'm carefully moving the scale upwards, wiggling it off the pivot nut. And here is the internal composition of the knife. We're going to set the scale with the pivot area exposed upward. Here's the plunger. Pardon my band-aids, such as the life of a knife reviewer. Anyway, the spring is shaped like a barrel. So by doing that, they minimize the space required to accommodate the spring, made the knife thinner. So I'm going to set it aside on this side. And here's a clock spring. I call it clock spring because that's a style of a spring that was used in antique clocks. And here's our stop pin. It's a shouldered stop pin, so it's not fully free floating. And then the tolerances are pretty tight. It's a slip fit, so the blade removes from the pivot here. The important thing to remember, the spring is symmetrical. It doesn't matter if you lay it down like this or flip it over and lay it down like that for reassembly. So we're going to drop it in. We're going to flip the blade and line up on the spine side of the scale. We're going to move the blade toward the spine of the scale and then line it up, making sure we capture that spring in the slot. And you can check it by doing what I'm doing here. Okay, we will then rotate the blade, holding our index finger on the pivot, arrest the blade. We need to grab that stop pin and insert it in the hole, and then allow the blade to return toward the stop pin and stay there. Do not release this pressure yet. So at this point, we're going to apply a little bit of a grease inside the plunger so that the barrel spring does not fall out when I flip it over, because that's the only way you can reassemble. And that's the difference from the launch one and all the consequent launches until this one. You were working from this side because the pivot was removable. So anyway, now with grease in there, you are able to place the plunger right into that relief cut on the back of the blade. And here I'm making sure, pressing it down and allowing it to come up, that it lined up with the cutout. Don't worry, it will not sit absolutely vertically, and I'll show you how to align it later. Okay, so now if you noticed, I switched the pressure onto the blade, and that's where the pocket clip actually helps. It creates this nice sort of I wouldn't call it a plane, but it actually axis of force application. So it doesn't allow anything here to pop out. The pivot knot is a little bit longer than on other models. So I will find that hole in the blade, rotate it in, don't go too far. And then with some finesse, I'm going to try to capture the stop pin hole and that plunger. And the plunger will want to be, the hole is pretty tight that for the plunger, so it will try to be stubborn here. There you go. That was the scale setting onto the stop pin. And now I'm going to persuade it, the plunger, to come through the hole. And this is the second click. And now I can flip the knife over, and you can see that the blade is spaced correctly. Nothing is showing. The plunger is there, and it's operable right there. And now I can flip it over. You should still have your T8 on the driver. Drop the pivot screw in. And just barely tighten it. Barely tighten it because there are no washers. The washers are machined in integral aluminum. So the knife is basically functional at this point. And I am switching to T6 and just simply tightening these two screws. If so far you are satisfied with the amount of effort that I put in this video, please do the following. Click the share button and copy the link, just in case you decide to send it later to your friends. Yep, so it's still trying to align itself, which it did, okay? And I check for play. There's a little bit of a play. This knife is extremely sensitive to how tight the pivot is. So I am planning to actually remove the pivot in a second and put a little bit of Loctite on it once I'm satisfied with where the blade is. And I'd like to show you a good way of applying Loctite to the pivot screw that I came up with. It's pretty straightforward. You remove the pivot, use non-permanent Loctite or thread locker compound. And now I'm screwing it all the way in. And when the pivot screw bottoms out, I then rotate the blade in a forward out of lock position and basically start unscrewing the pivot. You can see the blade moves, and when it locks in position, it's set. Check for function, you're good to go. Kershaw is one of the few remaining American companies who still advertises Rockwell hardness of their blades on the website, right on the company website. Here it is. And I find it very admirable. But I go by the principle trust but verify. This is a beautifully ground blade. Just look at the satin finish, overall profile, really well thought through blade. But is it truly 62 to 64 Rockwell hardness? This is their first out-the-side automatic made with a MagnaCut blade. Let's see if they did hit this perfect hardness range in my next video. To subscribe, click on my logo coming up on the right. This way you won't miss the video.